Welcome to Brain Structure in the Mind, Chapter 7 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. First, we're going to consider the parts of the nervous system. So the nervous system is essentially the equivalent of our body's internet. It provides for a flow of sense signals from our cells and organs to the brain and command signals from our brain to our muscles and organs. And this is a website link for greater information. Those who are familiar, this will just be a review. So nervous system, you have cranial nerves, that's ones that go to the brain from eyes, mouth, ears, and other parts of your head. Central nerves are in your brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nerves go from your spinal cord to your arms, hands, legs, and feet. And autonomic nerves go from your spinal cord to your lungs, heart, stomach, intestines, bladder, and other organs. This is a nice little visual of the brain structure. Starting from the spinal cord, it's connected through the brain stem, the hypothalamus, the limbic lobe, and the cerebral cortex. And we're going to discuss these a little bit more. So the spinal cord is responsible for flow of sensory information and motor instruction to and from the body, many reflexes, and damage to the spinal cord can lead to complete paralysis. So very, very important. Brain stem is associated with regulation of breathing, blood pressure, pulse rate, swallowing, pupil dilation, those kind of actions in the body. Typically, reflexes do not go further than here. An instinctive response, it'll go up the spinal cord, up to the brain stem, but it doesn't go any further into the brain. Basically, if you need to respond very, very quickly, there is just not enough time for it to go to the higher functionings of the brain. The hypothalamus, that coordinates both the autonomic nervous system and the activity of the pituitary gland, associated with body temperature, thirst, hunger, other homeostatic systems, and involved in sleep and emotional activity. Now, the limbic system is where humans start to get very interesting. So one part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, associated with episodic memory, spatial orientation, learning from novel events, and formation of new neurons essential for brain plasticity, which we'll discuss a little later on. And then there is the amygdala, associated with emotional responses, feelings, called the fight or flight response, and for forming fear-based memory. So the amygdala is where a lot of our actions and decision-making coming out of our emotions, especially fear-based emotions, get triggered. Then if we go deeper into the brain, we reach the cerebral cortex. So that's that folded gray matter you see in images of the brain. It's separated into two hemispheres. And it's associated with, again, higher functions like attention, perception, thought, language, consciousness, and many other activities. And each half is associated with some specialization. So generally the left handles language and speech, the right handles emotions and facial recognition, among other things. The corpus callosum, which is predominantly made of white matter as compared to gray matter, is critical for communication between the two hemispheres. So the functioning of the whole brain is not just the two separate halves, which tend to specialize, but they also have to be connected so that all of it works together. So what about some of the cells in the brain? We have neurons. They act like the wiring in a computer where electric signals flow and are rerouted. And within it, you have the soma, which is essentially the cell body. Then you have axons. These are cable-like projections, which are myelinated. In other words, they're covered in a sheath of fat, which make it easier for it to transmit electric signals in the same way that you might see a cable. And they form synapses at the termination when contacting other cells. So this is how we get all the communication and signal transfer between all the different neurons in our brains. And then there are dendrites, which cover the soma, and they act like the receiving part of the neuron. Then there are glial cells. Three basic types are astroglia or astrocytes. There is oleoglia and microglia. Astrocytes, they're called that because they're star-shaped, and they provide biochemical support of neurons and other cell types. And they have a major role in repairing and scarring process of brain and spinal cord after injuries. And they guide the growth of neurons and axons during development. And they do seem to also be involved in information processing. Oligodendrocytes, they're the ones that form a myelin sheath that enables axons to transmit electric signals. All these different cells play different roles in the regulation and structure of the brain, as well as the communicating and processing of information. And microglia is associated with the immune system for the brain, and it's necessary because there is a blood-brain barrier that is important for avoiding infection in the brain, which would be very, very difficult for the body to otherwise handle. And it seems to also be associated with synaptic pruning. Speaking of which, synapses. So these are the structures that allow neurons to pass a signal to other cells. They move between neurons at the narrow gaps between axon terminals of one cell and the dendrites of another. And this is done using neurotransmitters, which are molecules emitted by the presynaptic cell and are received by the postsynaptic cell through receptors. We said before, astrocytes are also help regulate neurotransmission at the synapse. And the strength of two connected neural paths is believed to lead to information storage and thus memory. The stronger the connection, the more easily available a memory. So we can understand it as if you use something frequently, the brain will make it easier to transmit the information for something that's going to be used frequently. Okay, so a little bit more. Right brain, some speculate that it's associated with more intuitive functions, left brain with more rational functions. As we mentioned before, corpus callosum is the brain tissue that connects the two halves. There has been some studies done on what we refer to as split brain. So these are people who, based on certain health conditions, had the corpus callosum cut. It was believed at one point that that was one way of stopping seizures because it slowed down the movement of electricity in the brain. And one of the things that is very interesting about people with split brain is that they process information from each eye separately. So you can actually run an experiment with someone with a split brain, and if you have an image that, one eye can see it but the other one can't, you will get different responses to answers based on whether you're communicating in a way that is more left brain or more right brain. Now, a very important discovery or development in the studying of the brain relatively recently is brain plasticity. And there's a book called The Brain That Changes Itself by Deutsch that gets into all this. The recognition is the brain is constantly developing new neural pathways and, to a certain extent, growing new neurons. For a long time, it was believed that the brain did not grow new neurons, so it's whatever you had when you were born, that was it. But in fact, to a certain extent, new neurons can be grown. So the implication is that with brain plasticity, the brain can adapt to new stimulus and under some circumstances can be changed by how we choose to perceive the world. So there is a potential feedback mechanism between the choices of how to perceive the world and how the brain develops. Very, very important development in understanding how we gain control of our behavior and the way we think and the way we perceive. People who suffered traumatic experiences when children had smaller corpus callosums, which is suggestive of the body adapting to this by making it more difficult to recall them. This is the link to the article that discusses this. So what is the implication? Well, our brains affect our awareness, consciousness, decisions, choices, and actions, which in turn affect how our brain generates and grows its connections and structures. So it's a recursive process. It's a feedback mechanism. This is very much associated with the way we're thinking about the decision-making process, and part of decision-making when we're making choices about who we are. That shows up in choices that lead to how our brains are going to develop. What's going to be stronger in the brain, what's going to be weaker. And now it's not necessarily a conscious decision, but there is this feedback mechanism. Now, we've talked about the role of time in decision making, and it's very interesting to notice that the brain, again, because there's a lot of electric activity, gamma brain waves are somatosensory, so they have to deal with senses, passing information, typically at the unconscious and a very physical level. So these have the shortest wavelengths. Beta brain waves are associated with alert waking time, and they're the next longest wavelength. Alpha is associated with relaxed or reflection, even longer wavelengths. Theta is when people kind of get drowsy or your mind is just idling. Again, a longer wavelength. And the very longest wavelengths are associated with delta brain waves, which is associated to deep dreaming sleep. Researchers vary slightly on the exact range of these boundaries, particularly around the shorter wavelengths. So these numbers are more suggestive than absolute. And meditative states tend to be associated with alpha and theta waves. So next thing we want to consider is short-term and long-term memory. So we're dealing with the distinction between remembering an act and remembering how to act. This is similar to consuming an experience and generating capital from an experience. And here is another link to an article on short-term memory to long-term memory. Suggestive ideas about evolution and brain structure. So the individual structure and wiring of the brain affect which actions and experiences are immediately feasible. So however your brain is wired right now, that is pretty much going to determine how you're going to respond in the next second. However, when we start talking about longer periods of time, within a lifetime, neuroplasticity would imply that there's some ability to modify what is possible with commitment to repeated practice. To the extent that you can make small changes to your behavior, but you repeat it over and over and over again, you can make certain behaviors easier, either in terms of physical actions or mental processing. However, once we start talking about repeated lifetimes, so many generations of a particular species, the overall structure of the brain would have developed to enable a wider range of time frames with which to perceive and choose actions. So if you look at the brain structure, we do see that something like the cerebral cortex is operating in such a way that you need significantly more time to respond to a stimulus in order to take advantage of that. So we can imagine that as Homo sapiens have been more successful, especially with planning, that would tend to reinforce the parts of the brain that make it easier to plan and to consider long-term consequences. So let's consider memory. And since this is a course in economics, one of the functions of money is a store of value. How does memory get associated as a store of value? Well, so to be a store of value, an object must exist through time, and the perceived value of that object must maintain through time. So an object becomes valuable as capital, not just financial capital, but any kind of capital, when the economic entity starts to perceive and use it that way. So if we land on an alien planet and they've got technology, but it is so foreign to how we understand the world, we don't even see it as technology. Maybe we just see it as a natural formation. We have yet to perceive and use it that way. It doesn't have value at that point yet. So the idea then is the brain as the medium of exchange of the mind. We'll talk about memory and capital a little bit more. So capital is understood as the resources a decision maker has available to produce goods, services, and experiences. The quantity of capital increases when more capital is produced, such as making computers. Whereas raw materials are used once, and that's it, capital can be used repeatedly. So, for example, wood can be used for fire once, but can be used as a chair many times. So this is one of the distinctions between raw material and capital. And this was a very important distinction that early economists were bringing up when they were trying to understand the nature of different types of resources. Now, the quantity of capital decreases as it's used in production. So, for example, wear and tear on machines. This is called depreciation. In some cases, the quantity of capital decreases even when it is not used at all. For example, if you don't use your muscles, they atrophy. Atrophy of human capital. Same idea is if you don't practice a skill, if you don't bring a memory to mind on a frequent basis, it atrophies. And the way atrophy in part shows up in the brain is the loss of the synaptic connections. As we mentioned before, if you do a behavior, if you use a function over and over again, you are left with a greater number, stronger connections, because it's more likely to be used. But if you don't use something for a long period of time, those connections wither. And so they become more difficult to access. So capital and memory have some very similar qualities. The organization of the brain and its overall health impacts which facts we remember, what skills we have, and how we can enjoy life. Financial capital can be conceived as data, and hence memory, that also expresses ownership. Cryptocurrency and blockchain, these are sets of data with a timestamp showing ownership. Right? So it's not just data, it's data that's associated with ownership. Okay, how about liquidity and time? Well, financial liquidity means the ability to immediately make a payment. So cash is perfectly liquid. Items like real estate or rare artwork are highly illiquid. They take a long time to sell. Maybe houses don't take as long as they used to, but you still have to sell them. And liquidity is not just about time, it's also resources you have to use to liquidate an asset. So the more illiquid an item, the greater the time to make it liquid. Back in the early 20th century, when economists were trying to understand the nature of capital, one of the things they recognize is the more liquid an asset, the more useful for exchange. Cash, most types of money, can be used almost immediately to buy something. On the other hand, cash is not particularly useful for producing something itself. It's good for buying, not necessarily so good with producing something. The more fixed an asset, things like machines and buildings, that's where you have more productivity available. So in terms of plasticity and productivity, so plasticity as an adaptability, there is this balancing act that our brain and our minds will be dealing with. We need some things that are fixed that enable us to be productive, but at the same time, because the environment changes, we want to have some elements that are adaptable. So we can imagine this balancing act where most of our brain pretty much stays the way it is, but there is some capacity for adaptability, especially over a period of time. We don't get fixated in only one way of thinking or one way of behaving. Okay, so that was a little summary there. Next chapter, we will look at the economics of mind.